Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Vincent Makori is filling in for Shaka Sali. Hello, Vincent.
Hey, hi, Paul.
How are you?
I'm fine. I'm happy to be here with you today.
Good to have you back again.
Thank you.
Good. A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka, but today Shaka is not there. He's out sick, but my colleague Vincent Makori, the managing editor of Africa 54, is here to fill in those big shoes. So let's start in London, Vincent.
Yes.
U.S. President Donald Trump is on a state visit in London. Of course, it did not come without a controversy. Your thoughts?
Well, you know, he has kind of kicked up a storm way before, even actually in the first year of his presidency, and given the kind of the fact that he took sides in Britain. He supported people who are on the other side of the debate on Brexit, people like Farage and others, Boris Johnson. So he kind of is a person who has politically taken sides, and some of the politicians have not really warmed up to him, particularly the mayor of London, who he has traded some barbs with. Sadiq Khan. He has called him names, and Sadiq has also, you know, called him a few unpleasant names. One of the things, of course, that people have to realize that it's not so much about just those particular individuals, but actually it's all his positions that he has taken on immigration, on the economy, and his approach, you know, the America First, and what people in Britain perceive to be undermining the global order of things when it comes to immigration issues. There's so many in Britain, you know, especially immigrants, see him as a person who is nationalist, anti-immigrant, and even a few of those who are, you know, pure Britons, you know, feel that that is something that is undermining the progression of the, you know, more inclusive society. But other than that, I think he has kind of gotten the rare honor of being invited to this state banquet, to a state visit. There are not many U.S. presidents who have been invited to a state visit. Although many have met the Queen before, but this is one of those few times where somebody can say it is a great honor for him to be invited for a state visit, to have a banquet. And also the reality is that they have still a very strong relationship between Britain and the United States, regardless of all that.
Absolutely. The UK is the biggest or the largest trading partner with the United States. But besides that, what is the significance of this particular trip? When you put it in context, or when you look at what has been done, said, or the prompt and that they gave to President Donald Trump, what do you make out of it?
The thing is, this is an endorsement of the relationship, the solid relationship between Britain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The reality is that these two countries remain the strongest of allies in the world. The Anglo-American relationship cannot be compared to any other. And also, it also comes also as a way of the British recognizing, as all as they have, the contribution that the United States made during the Second World War in defeating Hitler, who was kind of overtaking the entire Europe and the entire world as such during the time of Churchill. So the relationships are based on, first, historical reasons, an alliance that they forged many, many years ago, way from First World War to Second World War, but also the economic linkages that this have. So the visit is an endorsement of those relationships. The bickering over the political differences, individual egos, those are minor things. They come to pass. The underlying foundations of the relationship between the U.S. and the United Kingdom are solid and they're not being changed by any of the momentary, political temperatures that may rise on both sides of the pond.
Especially in light of the Brexit, they have been having a debate as we speak today. Theresa May is going to be out. Very soon she will be former Prime Minister of Great Britain, partly because she has failed to bring a deal about the Brexit. And so I guess the United States plays that void in the absence of a deal.
I mean, at the end of the day is that the United States has always said, okay, look, regardless of what happens, we will stay the same. We'll remain still as the closest allies. Remember that Britain never really fully became like 100% member of the European Union. They never abandoned their currency, the UK pound, the sterling pound rather. They never embraced the euro currency, for example. So they still kind of had one leg outside of the the European Union in some respects, in a fiscal way, and therefore the US becomes perhaps the reassuring pillar when Brexit happens, if it does actually happen, that regardless of what happens, it still stays kind of connected to the United States, and the economies are so well linked together that the economy of the UK is not going to collapse because they're leaving the European Union. Only kind of stagger a little bit, but they can always go back and continue enjoying the alliance across the oceans.
Speaking of the alliance, I like the fact that these two countries have been able to work together for a very long time. But one could also argue that despite all that, President Trump has been met with a lot of protesters. Right from the get-go, once they announced that he was planning to go there, people started planning these massive protests. How do you overcome that?
Yeah, I think he expected it himself. He actually has the distinction of being one of the presidents of the U.S. who has become extremely controversial. And one of the reasons is that he kind of is quick to speak his mind. And he started speaking his mind on issues that affect the British or that kind of rile the British way before. So there have been, remember I think a year or two back, Mayor Sadiq Khan had said that he will not welcome President Trump to London. So that was way before now. So his utterances, his tweets on all sorts of issues, from, remember, the climate. Some of those who were protesting against his position of climate, where the U.S. was, he took the U.S. out of the climate agreement. The issue of immigration. So many of those who are protesting are holding banners that say, resist racism. They are perceiving his position of immigrants as being racist. They are perceiving, for example, his attacks on the mayor of London as being anti-Islam. They see that as being an attack on not on him as a person, as a Briton, but as a Muslim. And he has relentlessly said that the person, Mr. Khan, the Mayor Khan, is doing a poor job and call him all sorts of names. So all this stemmed from his disposition. He's a guy who speaks freely, who doesn't hold back whatever he wants to say. And this is not very typical of the British. The British have a way of, they could insult you without you realizing. So they find him a little bit eccentric from their point of view, and therefore they're coming out in droves to the streets. But you know what? All this will come to pass. They'll make their point. He'll be done with his trip. He'll come back. Life goes on. The relationship between these two countries is not determined by the events of the 2 or 3 days on the streets of London. That will not change the relationship or the policies of the U.S. towards London or London towards Washington.
Somebody has a comment here on, a question rather, on the Brexit. Amina, let's go to Amina. You say, what is likely, hold on, Brexit is likely to have negative effects on Africa. How do you respond to that kind of concern?
There will be perhaps a short-term some ramifications because, the UK became part of the European Union, and so some of the dealings with the UK between the European Union and the United and Africa as a continent will kind of have to be reconfigured. But you see, in the last 1 year, British officials have been traveling to the continent of Africa to kind of try now to delink some of the dealings they had through the European Union to have a direct interaction with individual African countries. Initially, there will be a state of confusion because now the British will separate themselves such that they will have a different engagement with African countries as opposed to the engagement that African countries will have with the European Union as a bloc. Some may argue in a healthy competition, this might actually be beneficial to the African continent in that the British will try to make their impact felt in their relationship and investment in Africa, while the European Union may try to show that perhaps it's better to operate with them. And as a consequence, in that good competitive kind of environment, African countries might be there to gain. If they strategize smartly, they might actually benefit. I don't see any loss here because nothing is going to stop happening. It's only that the operation mode will change a little bit.
Okay, operation mode will change. I guess that's a perfect segue to our next segment. Let's talk about Sudan, the crisis in Sudan. It's been a couple months too long. We still see protesters on the streets in Khartoum, protesters everywhere demanding for a peaceful transfer of power since the fall of long-time leader Omar al-Bashir. Who's been, I guess, quote-unquote, incarcerated somewhere. We don't know whether he's in prison, but the rumors are out there that he's been locked up somewhere. What do you make of these new developments, especially in light of the fact that more than 30 people have been killed by the military?
The new developments of the military actually saying they're suspending all the deals they've signed with the civilian activists, and now that they're calling for a snap election, for me, they were predictable. They were predictable in the sense that people have to realize that just like a few other countries, Sudan has been a military system. The regime in Sudan for many, many years, the ruling system has been military, and therefore the systems are militarized. Now, when the citizens came up in this revolution, as they say, Bashir was kicked out of town, was taken out of power. But you have to realize who actually overthrew Omar al-Bashir. Was it the civilians, the citizens, or the military? It was a coup staged by the military guys themselves. Now, as a result, they did not necessarily promise that they are taking themselves out of the equation of running that country. All they did is to take Bashir, who is one of them, out of the equation. And they said they were willing to stretch a hand to the civilian activists and politicians and come up with something that will be palatable to the citizens of Sudan. Problem is, because the system is highly and deeply militarized, the military people are not willing to disengage themselves significantly. Now, the negotiations have hit roadblocks because the civilians in South Sudan, or rather in Sudan, are insisting that they actually want a purely civilian government, or to some degree, a configured transitional system or government that has a majority of the civilians. Now, power is sweet. These guys in the military have been entrenched for years, for decades, in fact. They're not willing to move an inch. Now, what happens after time? The people, the civilians, realize that they're negotiating with the same guys who are beating them up, who are killing them before Bashir was thrown out of power. Those military guys are acting exactly as you would expect. They want to have the biggest say. They want to have the control that they've been having anyway in that system, but if possible, have a token of civilians in the system. And that's the problem.
Going back to the point you made earlier, you talked about how the military establishment has been entrenched in Sudan for a long time, and there's probably nothing much they can do. How about those people who argue that perhaps maybe this is the time that the military can try to accommodate some of these people? They don't have necessarily to get out of power and maybe hand over power, but at least they can bring in a civilian face who is going to be the face of the revolution to be in charge of the country.
Yeah, they could do that.
Something
that is viable, that is tenable only if the military had a goodwill. Sometimes you get a sense that there is no goodwill in that whole system. They were kind of tired of Bashir. They themselves, I think they felt they don't need to keep defending Omar al-Bashir. But if they had goodwill, I think there is a place for the military in that system, in that government, but they could easily start a process of demilitarizing the government system of Sudan. They could deliberately do it, in as much as it's been a culture, but recognizing that in modern society, militaries are not supposed to be ruling and running a country.
That's a good point, but how they do that? Every institution in Sudan is run by a military guy. Everything revolves around that military dictatorship or military system of government.
But Paul, you have to realize, if you go back down in history, we have had actually military governments and dictatorships that eventually transitions into purely civilian governments. What you do is to create institutions and a constitution that actually removes the military from executive power, puts it in places where it's supposed to be, which is defense of the country, in the barracks, and you can have some of those strong officials running like ministries of defense, internal security, but you demilitarize the other sectors. I mean, you have the ministries of, for example, national development, the economy, foreign affairs. You can demilitarize those. But this could only work if the continent had a strong continental body. If the African Union was strong enough, they could actually even have suggested of helping create a transitional system where you could bring in not only Sudanese, but even outside experts to help in this interim period to find a way to demilitarize the system before the next election. It is possible if they wish. You can look in the histories of the world, so many countries, even Germany, during the time of Hitler. That was a military system, but it was eventually done away with. Today we have a purely civilian rule. In fact, if you go down to history,
although you could argue that during Hitler's time he was more of a benevolent dictator.
He was a benevolent dictator, but he militarized the system. It does everything. It was a military dictatorship anyway, but it doesn't matter whether you go to Mussolini and all those other people. There was a very strong, in the history of this world, militarized executive power. But eventually, when people realized that these things are not tenable, they demilitarized, especially the running of a country, and put the militaries where they belong, which is in the barracks and in the defense of their country, not in running the day-to-day affairs of the country. In fact, if you research well, militaries are not trained to run the country.
Absolutely.
That is not their training.
But in this particular case, the military, on the other hand, they're arguing that, for example, there is no way they can easily transition to a civilian life or a civilian government simply because everything there has been run as a military operation.
But that is what they want people to believe. But in other words, they're saying nothing is going to change. All that is changing is that Omar al-Bashir is out, and we're going to have another general. Now, I personally empathize with the civilians of Sudan in that they cannot trust the military, because the argument they're putting makes you wonder whether along the way, a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, they won't actually reach a conclusion that the best option for Sudan is actually having another general as the president. Of course, he may remove the military uniform and put on civilian...
just like it is in Zimbabwe.
Exactly. So I understand when they have this sense of apprehension about their future and distrust of the military. I personally will not trust the military to tell me that they will one day probably transition power to the civilians. They have to start showing that they're willing to do that now.
Let's move along. Let's go to your home country, Kenya. We have a comment, rather a question from Vincent Festus. For you, Vincent.
Yes.
What's your reaction on Kenyan as government effort to fight graft and corruption?
You know, we have to say that having been around for some time, I'm not too old, but I think I've been around enough to be really skeptical about these efforts. We have for decades now, let's say at least 2 decades or more, had the so-called the fight against corruption. Year in, year out. They name names, they mention scandals, they mention people, but the fact that we have not had a single powerful member of the government or accused, a senior government official who has been arrested, arraigned in court, found guilty, is sentenced to prison, and the wealth is told taken back to the citizens, to the public.
Wait a minute. I've seen senior government officials being arraigned. I've seen, for example, Maina, Dr. Maina, the Kenya Railways Corporation, and his colleagues were arraigned.
The courts have always been busy. We have had tribunals, we have had the inquiries and all that, but where does it end? Somewhere along the way, it fizzles out. Every case has somehow ended up somewhere and after some time forgotten, and all those officials get recycled. Some of them come back later as governors. Some of them end up becoming member of parliament. What happens is that they will take these cases to court, and when one of the cases is going on, another one comes up in another court, and another one. If you ask Kenyans, since last year, the beginning up to today, how many scandals have been there? How many people have been accused of corruption? How many of those, of course, were taken in front of the commissions and even the court? How many of them have actually been charged, found guilty, and been made to pay back the money they stole or gone to prison? It's not enough to say we have mentioned people, we have taken people before a court, but you have to really take it to the end in order to stop the corruption. You have to have, you have to show that there are consequences to stealing public funds.
How about the political will? For example, we've seen President Uhuru Kenyatta take the stand and say he's going to fight this. He's been serious in some cases. Are you suggesting that what we see is just more of a PR stunt, trying to say I'm fighting corruption?
You see, he has good intention. He has a political will. He has actually come out very strongly to say he's fighting corruption. Question is how complex the system is. Is he able to? Is he actually able to take the war of corruption, anti-corruption, to the very end? The optics are very important. We need to see at least one case that will be taken to the very end. I would like to see a very senior person who has been accused of corruption being found guilty, being thrown into prison, and if possible, the wealth that he stole being taken back to the public. Let's see something happening. It is not enough to say, to name, even to take people before the court systems. But you need to see the law take its course to the very end. We see this in the United States all the time. People get arrested and get jailed, regardless of whether they were governors or they were congressmen or they were, mayors. It doesn't matter. But you need to see the law really taking its course to the very end. It's not enough to keep talking about it in public fora. It's not enough to have people appear before the courts or before commissions of inquiry or anti-corruption, whatever commission. You need to see that guy behind the bar, and then we can talk after.
Let's talk about Caster Semenya, the Olympic 800-meter champion.
Yes.
Poor girl has had all sorts of things. He's an incredibly talented person, but circumstances surrounding her life or his life are not looking good as we speak. She's been in and out of court. Your thoughts on that?
First, wrong, not his life, her life. It's a girl.
Yes.
She's grown up as a woman. She's been running as a woman. And then when she started winning a lot, some people decided that now they need to check her testosterone and that she produces more than enough testosterone and she needs to suppress those testosterone.
But how? It should not undergo like any surgery to...
Here's what I won't say. This is not original from me, but if I quote, her mother apparently said she's been running for years and years, but only when she started winning and winning big that they started bringing up this issue. Why are they bringing it up? Only when she's winning. why should she be subjected to suppressing her testosterone? If she wasn't winning in these races, if she wasn't that good, would anybody be talking? I think, from my personal perspective, it is unfair. She's grown up as a girl. She happens to be a very strong athlete, and she should be allowed to run. And those who have a problem with that should practice harder and harder or accept that she's that good. Did we subject Usain Bolt to maybe has more testosterone than the other 100 meters runners? I mean, some people are stronger than others.
I also think it's a race issue here. Yeah. I think if she was a white woman, probably people would not be talking about her.
Yeah, there's a chance nobody will be talking about it. But this young girl from South Africa who is winning and beating up all these other girls on the... No, I think it's not fair to... She's been humiliated a lot. She's been subjected to trying to explain to the world who she is, apart from what she has grown up knowing she is. I mean, it's like somebody coming to you today and deciding that you're not what you believe you've been all your life. It is not. It's not fair at all.
Yeah, you know, the Chinese have a saying that man dreads fame just like a pig dreads fattening. Yeah. In this particular context, Samenya is the pig that they make reference to. Yeah. When the pig gets fat, they do what? They slaughter it. So for her becoming this champion, I think she's become a target.
That is the problem. The problem is that she's winning and winning big. If you remember, nobody brought up this issue until she started appearing like she's indomitable in the 800 meters race. That is when it became a big problem.
Well, tomorrow you're hosting Straight Talk Africa. Yes. What are you talking about?
We'll be talking about the power of incumbency. This is in relation to the elections across the continent. We realize and we notice many times that those who hold power, the incumbents, tend to win most of the time. Do they have certain advantages? So we'll look into that, explore why those who hold power already, the incumbent presidents, tend to almost always win the election. Why is that so? That is the topic of our discussion.
Okay, let's go to, we have time for one quick comment. Let's go to Kiambo Martin now. Why have the international observers for the elections in Malawi not come out publicly to state their opinions on the proceedings?
Let me disappoint you, because it's not only Malawi. They actually never, ever really come out very strongly about the results. They seem to have signed a pact where they don't want to ruffle feathers. They don't want to disrupt the system. They don't want to take sides. That's their kind of approach. So they normally just give those kind of blanket kind of reports where they say there were some issues here and there, but generally the elections went on well.
But that takes away the whole point of them being there in the first place.
Exactly, and people have come to, that's why people say perhaps the best observers are those internal observer groups, like the Malawian observer groups that are independent. You can rely on those than actually the international observer groups. They're very diplomatic, and this has made them become almost irrelevant. Yeah, I have covered elections, and I really don't care much about what international observers say. You better even listen to the local independent observers.
How about those who argue that those you call independent local observers are probably not independent, because in most cases they are funded by the state that is organizing the election?
Well, there's some. You have to look around. There's some that are actually, they will give you a fair layout of what happened, because they go to every polling station. They've been on the ground, because some of these elections, something that we can discuss another time, the elections are rigged before they happen. So some of the locals have been around on the ground long enough to tell you exactly where the rigging began from, where the manipulation started from. Now, the guys who just jet in and they visit, and I've visited with them, go to a polling station, observe people placing there, and then they talk to the officials there. Any problem here? They make... They have a very shallow understanding of what happens on the ground.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, it's been great. Thank you so much, Vincent.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Take care.